In a quiet, remote village by the sea, nestled among rolling hills and dense woods, there lived a reclusive woman named Margaret. She had spent the majority of her life in the small cottage that had been passed down through generations. A place where the ocean breeze whispered through the trees and the salty air carried the scent of wildflowers. For most of her life, Margaret had been alone. She had no family, and few neighbors who came to visit. But there was one exception: a fox named Saul. Years ago, when Margaret was still young, she had found Saul as a cub, barely more than a bundle of fur. Injured and trembling by the edge of the woods, she had taken him in, nursed him back to health. And from that day on, Saul never left her side. Over the years, the bond between them had grown stronger, deeper. He had become her constant companion, her protector, and the closest thing to family she had ever known. People in the village often talked about Margaret and her fox. They couldn't understand why she preferred the company of an animal over humans. Some were suspicious, others were curious, but all of them acknowledged the unusual connection between the two. The villagers had long since learned to accept their unique relationship, but it was a source of gossip nonetheless. There were whispers about whether the fox was truly tame, or if it was simply waiting for the right moment to turn on her. But to Margaret, Saul was more than just a pet. He was family, a creature of the wild who had chosen to share his life with her. Every morning, as the sun began to rise, Margaret would take her walks along the cliffside, with Saul padding silently by her side. They would pause by the ocean, the waves crashing below, and Margaret would take in the view. Saul would sit quietly, his ears twitching at the sound of the wind, as though listening to the world beyond. For years, their routine had been the same. Margaret would tend to her small garden, while Saul would roam the fields and woods surrounding their cottage, always keeping an eye on her from a distance. He was never far from her side, even when he ventured into the woods to hunt or explore. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a bond that transcended words. But lately, things had begun to change. The once playful fox had become more somber, less energetic. Margaret noticed the shift in Saul's behavior. The way he lingered longer by her side, often resting his head on her lap when she sat by the fireplace. At night, he would sleep at the foot of her bed, his soft breathing filling the silence of the cottage. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She hadn't spoken to anyone about it, not even the villagers, but deep down, she feared that Saul might be growing older. He had been with her for so many years, and she knew that the time they had together was limited. The thought of losing him was unbearable. But Margaret also knew that such things were inevitable in life. One afternoon, as Margaret worked in her garden, she noticed Saul standing by the edge of the woods, staring out toward the horizon. His posture was different, tense, alert. Margaret stood up, wiping her hands on her apron, and walked over to him. "Saul, what is it?" she asked softly, her voice carrying on the wind. But the fox didn't move. He simply stood there, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the trees, something that only he could see. Margaret stood beside him, watching the same view. The world seemed peaceful, calm, but the stillness in the air was unsettling. She could feel it in her bones, the shift in the world, the quiet anticipation that something was about to change. She didn't know what it was, but she knew that it would come soon. The days that followed were marked by an unusual silence. Saul, once full of energy and curiosity, now seemed more withdrawn. He no longer followed Margaret around the garden, nor did he playfully chase the birds that flew over the meadow. Instead, he spent most of his time near the cottage, lying in the shade of the trees or at the foot of Margaret's rocking chair, his amber eyes distant and thoughtful. Margaret couldn't help but feel the weight of his silence. She had always known him as a creature of the wild, one who reveled in his freedom. But now, he seemed lost in a sorrow of his own. One evening, as twilight fell and the sky turned a soft pink, Margaret sat on her porch, knitting a shawl for herself. The evening breeze carried the salty tang of the sea, but it wasn't enough to lift her spirits. She glanced over at Saul, who was lying in the grass near the tree line, staring at the woods beyond. It was as if he could sense something she couldn't, something waiting in the shadows of the forest. "Saul," Margaret called softly, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. The fox flicked his ears, but he didn't move. Margaret's heart tightened in her chest. She had seen this behavior before in the animals that came to her for care, an instinctive knowing that something was about to happen. A shift in the world they lived in. As the evening wore on, Margaret felt a strange pull to go into the woods. It was as though the earth beneath her feet was calling to her, urging her to follow a path she had never walked before. With a sense of resolve, she stood up from the porch and walked toward the trees. Saul followed her, though he didn't walk beside her as he usually did. Instead, he trailed behind her, his head low and his steps slow, as though something in the forest had made him hesitant. The woods were thick with shadows as they entered, the canopy of trees above blocking out the last light of the evening. Margaret pushed through the underbrush, her senses alert to every rustle and snap of the branches. She had walked these woods many times before, but tonight, it felt different. The air was heavy, thick with an energy that she couldn't name. As they ventured deeper into the forest, Margaret's thoughts wandered back to the days when Saul had been a cub. When he had first appeared at her door, she remembered how small he had been, how fragile, and how she had made a promise to him then, she would always protect him. No matter what, she wondered, now, if the time had come for her to honor that promise in a way she hadn't expected. Just as she was about to call out to Saul, she noticed something in the distance. A figure emerged from the trees, a silhouette against the dimming light. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a steady gait. He moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the forest, as though he had been waiting for them. Margaret froze, her heart racing. She had never seen this man before, and something in her gut told her that his presence was not a coincidence. He wasn't just passing through the woods, he was searching for something. Margaret stepped back, her body tense with caution. Saul, too, had noticed the stranger. His tail bristled, and he growled softly under his breath, stepping in front of Margaret as though to protect her. Margaret gently placed a hand on his back, calming him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She had lived in these woods long enough to know when something was wrong, and this man's presence felt like the first stirrings of a storm. The man stepped closer, his boots crunching softly on the leaves as he approached. When he was only a few feet away, he stopped and regarded Margaret with a steady, almost unreadable gaze. His eyes were sharp, and there was something unsettling about them, an intensity that suggested he knew exactly what he was looking for. "I've been looking for you," he said, his voice low but clear. "I'm Gideon Roy. I've heard about your fox. He's not just any animal, is he?" Margaret's stomach turned. She could feel the weight of his words settling in the air around her. She had never spoken to anyone about Saul in the way this man seemed to be implying. She had always kept their bond private, not wanting to invite the kind of attention that might lead to questions. "What do you want with Saul?" Margaret asked, her voice steady despite the unease gnawing at her. Gideon smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I know a lot about animals like him," he said. "Foxes, wolves, creatures that live at the edge of human society. I could help you understand him better. I could make him safer for both of you." Margaret took a step back. She had never trusted anyone who spoke in such vague terms. "I don't need your help," she replied firmly. "Saul is fine the way he is." Gideon's expression hardened slightly. "You don't understand. There are forces at work here, things beyond your control. Your fox isn't just a pet. He's part of something much larger. And it's only a matter of time before the world catches up with him. You can't protect him forever." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. She had always known there was something extraordinary about Saul, but hearing it from this man's lips made it all too real. The fox wasn't just a companion, he was a symbol of something greater. And now, it seemed, others were starting to take notice. Margaret stood there, trying to process everything Gideon had said. His words lingered in the air, heavy with implication. "A force beyond your control," he had said. It sent a shiver down her spine. She had always known that there was something special about Saul, but she had never imagined it would attract this kind of attention. Saul, sensing Margaret's unease, stepped closer to her, his eyes locked on Gideon with a watchful gaze. He growled low, his body tense, as if preparing for something. Margaret placed a hand gently on his back, but her mind was racing. The man in front of her seemed calm, but there was something unsettling about him. A predatory gleam in his eyes that reminded her of the wild, dangerous world they lived in. "You don't know what you're dealing with," she said firmly, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Saul is a part of my life. And I won't let anyone take him or use him for some experiment." Gideon raised an eyebrow. Unfazed. "I'm not here to experiment," he said, his tone smooth but insistent. "I'm here to help you understand what you're really dealing with. Your bond with that fox. It's not something you can just ignore. There are people who would exploit it, use it for their own gain." Margaret's heart pounded. She had always known that her connection with Saul was unique. But this was the first time someone had made her question the implications of it. "I don't want your help," she said again, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to stay calm. Gideon studied her for a moment, as if weighing her words. Then he stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "You don't have a choice. There are bigger forces at play here. Margaret, you can either work with me, or you'll end up on the losing side." Margaret's mind raced. She had lived in isolation for so long, never thinking that anything beyond her small world with Saul could affect her. But now, she realized that maybe, just maybe, her quiet life in the woods was more connected to a larger world than she had ever imagined. Before she could respond, a rustling noise interrupted the moment. Both Margaret and Gideon turned toward the sound. Saul growled again, his ears perked up, sensing something nearby. From the thicket emerged another figure, this one smaller, more agile, with the unmistakable silhouette of a fox in the distance. It was another creature, one that Margaret had never seen before. But the way it moved, the way it held itself, it was no coincidence. Gideon's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "You see?" he said softly. "You're not the only one." Margaret's heart skipped a beat as the second fox stepped into view. This one was sleek, with fur that shimmered in the fading light. The two foxes locked eyes. And for a brief moment, there was a sense of recognition between them, like they shared some unspoken understanding of the world they lived in. But this new fox was different. It wasn't just the way it moved, it was the air of quiet purpose that surrounded it. The two foxes circled each other, their tails brushing the ground like ripples on a calm pond. Margaret felt a sudden pang in her chest. A mixture of awe and trepidation. Was this another fox like Saul? Or was it something else entirely? It was impossible to tell. Yet Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that its arrival wasn't mere coincidence. Gideon watched the scene unfold with a strange satisfaction in his eyes. As though he had known exactly how it would play out. He crossed his arms over his chest. His posture relaxed, but there was an intensity in his gaze that was unmistakable. "You see now, don't you?" he asked. His voice soft yet firm. "This isn't just about you and Saul. There's a bigger picture here. That fox, the one standing before you, it's not here by accident. It's here because of you. Because of your connection to Saul." Margaret's mind raced. She had always known her bond with Saul was deep, beyond anything she could explain. But the idea that it might have attracted other creatures with their own motives, it was too much to process. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "You keep saying there's something bigger at play. What does that even mean?" Gideon smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. "It means that the world you know is changing. Margaret, the wild, the things you thought you understood, those things are evolving. Your bond with Saul, this connection, it's a part of that evolution." Margaret looked at the two foxes again. The one she knew and the new one. They stood still now, side by side, as if they were waiting for something to happen. She didn't understand it, but something inside her told her that the moment of reckoning was coming. Whether she liked it or not, her life was about to change. Gideon continued, his tone a mix of warning and invitation. "The choice is yours. You can fight this. Try to resist the pull of something larger than you. Or you can embrace it. You can let Saul show you what the future holds." Margaret swallowed hard. This was not the life she had imagined for herself when she first took Saul in. She had wanted peace, isolation, and simplicity, but the world was bigger than that. And now, she could feel the weight of that truth pressing on her. Before she could respond, Saul growled again, low and steady. The new fox stepped forward, its eyes locking with Margaret's as if it had something to tell her. A warning? A promise? She couldn't tell, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Margaret stood still, watching the two foxes. The air between them was thick with an unspoken understanding. She didn't know what was happening, but she could feel the change in the atmosphere. The arrival of this second fox, so unlike the playful Saul she had known, felt like the beginning of something bigger. But bigger meant uncertainty, and Margaret didn't know if she was ready for it. Gideon, sensing her hesitation, spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "This is why I came. Saul isn't just any fox. He's a symbol, Margaret, a bridge between the wild and the human. And the world is starting to take notice." Margaret's heart raced. She had always known Saul was special. But this was beyond anything she had imagined. "I don't want any part in this," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "He's just a fox. He's my companion. I don't need anyone to tell me what he is." Gideon took a step closer, his eyes never leaving her. "It's not about what you want, Margaret. This isn't just your bond with Saul anymore. The world is changing, and your bond is part of that change." Margaret clenched her fists. "I don't want to be part of anything that involves danger or people taking Saul away from me." Gideon's expression softened slightly, but his words were unwavering. "I'm not here to take him away. I'm here to help you see what's coming. You'll have to decide if you want to be a part of it or not." Margaret glanced at Saul. He wasn't the same fox he had been when she first found him. He had grown older, quieter, and there was something in his eyes now that suggested he knew something she didn't. The second fox, still standing by her side, flicked its tail as if reminding her of its presence. "You're not the only one," Gideon said. "Saul has been waiting for this moment too. This fox came here because it senses the same thing. The world is changing, and creatures like Saul are part of it." Margaret took a deep breath. She had lived in her peaceful cottage for so long, never thinking much beyond her quiet life. But this conversation, these animals, had pulled her into something much larger. "I can't change the world," Margaret whispered, more to herself than anyone. "I just want to protect Saul." "You can protect him," Gideon replied, his voice softening, "but you have to understand that this isn't just about protecting him. It's about understanding what he represents, what he's a part of, and that means facing what's to come." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle. She didn't want to be part of some grand design, but it seemed the world had a way of dragging you into things, whether you were ready or not. With a reluctant nod, she stepped forward, looking at Saul one last time. The fox stepped forward as well, his gaze steady and full of knowing. "I'm not sure I can accept this," she said softly, "but I think I need to know more." Margaret felt the weight of Gideon's words press on her chest. It wasn't just about Saul anymore. Something much larger was at play, something that involved forces beyond her understanding. And it was clear that Gideon was determined to make her see it. She had tried to keep her life simple, to keep Saul as a companion, a friend, but now, that simple life was crumbling before her eyes, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. "What do you really want, Gideon?" Margaret asked, her voice steady but laced with frustration. "You keep talking about a bigger picture. But what's the point? What is it that you're trying to get me to do?" Gideon's gaze never wavered. He stepped closer, his eyes now narrowing with intent. "I'm trying to help you understand, Margaret. Saul, your bond with him, is more than just a connection between you and an animal. There are powers, people, who are interested in this. They're watching, waiting for the right moment. They know about Saul. They know about the bond you share." Margaret shook her head in disbelief. "What are you saying? That there are people out there who want to take Saul from me? To use him for something else?" "Exactly," Gideon replied. "They don't understand the connection you have. But they know that it's special. They see Saul as a tool, a resource. They think that if they can control him, or you, they can harness something much greater." Margaret's stomach churned at the thought. "I won't let anyone use him. Saul is mine. He's not some tool for someone else's gain." "I'm not asking you to give him up," Gideon said, his tone softer now. "But you need to see that this bond you have is part of a much larger story. The connection you two share, it's something rare. Something that can't be ignored. You have a choice, Margaret. You can continue to hide and try to protect him from the world. Or you can embrace what's coming. You can be a part of something bigger than yourself." Margaret's mind spun as she processed his words. She couldn't believe it, but there was something in Gideon's voice, in his eyes, that made her question everything. "And what if I choose not to get involved? What if I want to keep Saul and my life the way it is?" Gideon smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was cold, calculating. "Then the world will come for him, Margaret, and it won't be kind. If you try to protect him from what's coming, you'll only make things worse." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you want me to do, then?" I want you to understand that this isn't just about you and Saul. It's about a shift, a change in the natural order. You're at the center of it. Whether you like it or not, the world is waking up to what you two represent." Gideon's words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Margaret felt the weight of it all, the responsibility, the uncertainty. She had never wanted this kind of attention. She had only wanted to live quietly with Saul, in peace. But now, it seemed, she had no choice. The world was coming, and she had to decide whether to face it or hide. Margaret clenched her fists, her thoughts racing. She had to do something. The weight of Gideon's words still hung over her. But standing there, talking, wasn't helping. Her gut told her that she had to make a decision. And soon, Saul had moved away from the conversation. His attention focused on something further down the path. His ears pricked. Margaret's eyes followed his gaze. Her body tensing. There was something moving in the trees. A shadow. Barely noticeable but unmistakable. Before she could react, a low growl rumbled from Saul's throat. His stance shifting. Margaret's heart skipped. The air felt thick with tension. Gideon noticed the shift, his eyes narrowing as he turned towards the trees. "It's them," he muttered, though his voice was calm. The figure emerged, tall, dressed in dark, practical clothing, moving with purpose. A man, no older than 30, his eyes sharp and calculating. He didn't seem to care that Margaret and Gideon were standing there. His attention was fixed on Saul, and he carried a long net across his shoulders. Margaret's instincts kicked in. She stepped forward, putting herself between the stranger and Saul. "Stay away from him," she ordered, voice firm. The man paused, assessing her with cold indifference. "I'm just here for the fox," he said flatly. "No need for any trouble." "Trouble?" Margaret's hands tightened. "I don't care who sent you. You're not taking Saul anywhere." The man's expression didn't change. He shifted the net slightly. "Preparing. This doesn't have to get messy," he said, his tone implying that it would anyway. Before Margaret could react, Saul growled louder, his teeth bared. He wasn't backing down. The stranger glanced at Gideon, who stood back, his arms crossed. He wasn't intervening, but his gaze held something. Amusement? Approval? Margaret's pulse quickened. She knew she couldn't fight him alone. The man had the advantage, and Saul was in danger. But just as the man took a step forward, preparing to throw the net, Saul lunged. It happened too quickly, faster than the man could react. Saul's jaws snapped just inches from the stranger's leg, forcing him to step back, stumbling in the snow. "Get out of here," Margaret shouted. The man hesitated, eyes flicking between her and the fox. But he finally turned and retreated into the trees, muttering curses under his breath. Breathing heavily, Margaret rushed to Saul, her heart still pounding. "Good boy," she whispered, stroking his fur. But she knew this wasn't over. More would come. She had no doubt now that she was part of something much bigger than she had ever imagined. The next few days were a blur of constant tension. Margaret stayed close to Saul, never letting him out of her sight. Gideon had warned her that more would come, but she didn't fully grasp the extent of the danger until the day the hunters showed up. It was late in the afternoon when the first one appeared. A man, dressed in heavy camouflage gear, walked along the edge of the forest, scanning the trees with a trained eye. Margaret's heart sank. She had seen that look before, someone who was hunting, looking for prey. Saul, as if sensing the danger, growled low in his throat and backed into the shadows of the trees. Margaret rushed over to him, her breath caught in her chest. "Stay quiet," she whispered to Saul, her voice tight with anxiety. She knew there was no point in running, there was no escaping now. They had to face it. The hunter stopped, his gaze sweeping over the clearing. His eyes lingered on the tree line, where Margaret and Saul were hiding. Margaret held her breath, hoping he wouldn't see them, but luck wasn't on their side. The man's eyes locked onto hers. A smile crept across his face. "I've been looking for you," he said coldly. "You and your fox." Margaret's stomach twisted. She tried to keep calm. "I don't know what you want," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "But you're not taking Saul." The hunter took a step forward, his hand reaching for something on his belt. Margaret's body tensed, ready to protect Saul at any cost. She wasn't sure what the man intended to do, but she wasn't going to let him take Saul without a fight. Before she could act, Saul lunged forward, snapping his jaws just inches from the hunter's face. The man stumbled back, startled, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he pulled out a tranquilizer dart gun. Margaret's heart raced as she saw the weapon in his hand. "Stay back," she shouted. But the hunter was undeterred. He aimed and fired the dart with precision. Saul yelped in pain as the dart struck his side. But instead of falling, he turned and bolted into the trees, disappearing into the thick underbrush. The man cursed and ran after him. But it was too late. Saul was gone. Margaret stood frozen for a moment, her body shaking. The dart had missed its mark. But the hunter's presence was undeniable. They couldn't hide forever. She ran to the edge of the forest, calling out for Saul, her voice frantic. She had to find him. They had to leave before more hunters arrived. Margaret sprinted through the forest, her heart pounding in her chest. The snow crunched beneath her boots. But she hardly noticed the cold. She couldn't focus on anything except finding Saul. She called out his name, her voice breaking with panic. But there was no response. She pushed through the thicket, branches scratching at her skin, until she spotted a flash of movement ahead. Saul's pale fur glowed faintly in the twilight, his form darting between the trees. He was fast, too fast, and Margaret had to keep pushing herself to catch up. "Saul," she shouted again, her voice hoarse. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she caught up with him. The fox was panting heavily, his body trembling from the dart's effects. But he wasn't falling. Margaret reached out and gently placed her hand on his shoulder, her breath ragged. "I won't let them take you," she whispered, her fingers brushing through his fur. "You're safe now." Saul let out a low whine. As if he understood, he leaned into her touch, his body still tense from the fear and confusion. Margaret took a deep breath, steadying herself, trying to calm both herself and Saul. She knew they couldn't stay here, not with the hunters still out there. She pulled herself to her feet, helping Saul rise, though he swayed a bit under the strain of the tranquilizer. "Come on, we need to get out of here," she urged, leading him towards a small, hidden path she knew would lead to the old barn at the edge of the property. The path was narrow and winding, hidden by dense underbrush and trees. Margaret didn't know how much time they had, but she wasn't taking any chances. The barn would offer shelter, at least temporarily. They could hide there and figure out their next move. Saul walked beside her, still unsteady but trusting her. Margaret didn't dare look back, but she could hear the distant crunch of boots in the snow, the sound of someone following. They reached the barn just as the first lights of evening began to fade. Margaret hurriedly opened the door, pulling Saul inside. She made sure to lock it behind them, the rusted bolts creaking under the pressure. Inside, it was cold and dark, but it was safe. She knelt beside Saul, checking him over, feeling his tense body relax slightly now that they were out of the open. "We're safe for now," she whispered, "but I don't know how long that will last." She sat beside him for a while, her hand resting gently on his fur. There were too many questions, too many unknowns. What would happen next? Was it really just about them anymore? Or was there something much bigger at play? Margaret didn't have the answers. But one thing was certain, she wasn't letting anyone take Saul from her. Not now, not ever. The night stretched on quietly inside the barn, the only sounds being the occasional rustle of hay and Saul's labored breathing as he tried to rest. Margaret kept a vigilant watch, her mind racing. She kept hearing distant footsteps in the snow, the crunch of boots, hunters, looking for Saul. They wouldn't stop, and neither would she. As the hours passed, Margaret's thoughts shifted between Saul's condition and what Gideon had said. He had been right. The world was watching them. It wasn't just about her and Saul anymore. She could feel the weight of it all, the responsibility, the fear, but she had no choice now. Saul had become more than just a pet, he was a symbol. And that made him vulnerable. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine cut through the stillness. Margaret's heart stopped. Her instincts told her that it was trouble, that someone had found them. She cautiously crept to the barn door, peering out through a crack. The headlights of a truck flashed across the trees. The vehicle was moving slowly, searching, just like the hunters had done. Margaret stepped back into the shadows, her pulse racing. She turned to Saul, who had stirred at the sound of the engine. His golden eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw a flash of understanding. Saul knew what was at stake. He was ready to protect her, just as she was ready to protect him. The truck parked just outside the barn, its engine humming softly. The figure inside didn't move for a moment. Then the door opened, and a man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, his face covered by a hat. He was alone, but that didn't make Margaret feel any safer. His presence alone meant trouble. The man started walking toward the barn. Margaret's mind raced, her hands trembling as she searched for something, anything, that she could use to defend herself and Saul. Her eyes landed on a rusted pitchfork, propped against the wall in the corner. She grabbed it quickly, clutching it tightly in her hands. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The man's footsteps grew louder as he approached, and Margaret's grip tightened around the pitchfork. She stood still, barely breathing, waiting for the moment when she would have to make her move. The man's footsteps were almost upon the barn when Margaret made her decision. He was too close now, and she had no choice. She had to act first. The door to the barn creaked slightly as the man approached, but it was enough. He paused just outside, probably sensing something was off. Margaret's breath caught, but she steadied herself. Saul was with her, and together they would fight to protect what they had. As soon as the man stepped forward, Margaret darted from her hiding spot. Pitchfork in hand, she aimed for his legs, hoping to catch him off guard. The man barely had time to react. He staggered back as the prongs of the pitchfork dug into his boot. A grunt escaped his lips, and he reached for something at his waist. But before he could draw a weapon, Saul shot out from the shadows, teeth bared, and lunged at the man's leg. The man screamed, stumbling backward as Saul's jaws closed around his pant leg, forcing him to fall. The pitchfork was forgotten as the man scrambled to free himself. Margaret didn't hesitate. She grabbed Saul's collar and yanked him back, putting herself between the man and her fox. "Get away from us," she shouted, her voice fierce. The man glared at her, his face contorted with pain and frustration. "You're making a big mistake," he growled, trying to get up, but Saul had already positioned himself between the man and Margaret, ready for another strike if needed. Margaret's mind raced. She needed to get out of here before things escalated further. "We're leaving, and you'll never find us again," she said, her voice shaking, but strong. The man snarled but didn't try to approach them again. He knew he had lost. With a final glare, he stood up, brushing snow off his clothes, and slowly backed away. "This isn't over," he spat, disappearing into the trees. Margaret breathed a sigh of relief but didn't let her guard down. She waited until she was sure he was gone before turning to Saul. "Let's go, Saul," she whispered, pulling him gently toward the back of the barn. Saul was exhausted, but he followed her obediently, understanding that they needed to keep moving. Margaret glanced one last time toward the woods. The hunters might be gone, but the danger was far from over. She had no idea how long they could stay hidden, but for now, they were safe. The next few days passed in a blur. Margaret barely slept, constantly on edge, always watching for the next threat. She kept Saul hidden as best she could, moving between different places on the property, never staying in one spot for too long. It was exhausting, but there was no other choice. The hunters were still out there, and she couldn't afford to take any chances. One afternoon, as Margaret was walking through the woods with Saul, she caught sight of a familiar figure in the distance. It was Gideon, standing at the edge of the clearing, waiting for her. Margaret froze, instantly suspicious. "Gideon, what are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice sharp. Gideon held up his hands, as if to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Margaret," he said calmly. "I've been following the situation, and I think I might be able to help you." Margaret narrowed her eyes. "Help? After everything you said, I'm not sure I trust you." "I understand," Gideon said with a slight smile. "But I've been talking to some people. I have connections. If you want to keep Saul safe, I can get you the protection you need." Margaret hesitated. She had no choice but to listen. She had no idea how much longer they could hide, and if Gideon really had a way to get them out of this, it might be worth hearing him out. "What kind of protection?" Margaret asked, her voice wary. "I can get you both out of here," Gideon said, his voice low. "I can get you to a place where the hunters won't find you, where Saul can live in peace." Margaret's heart raced at the idea. A place where Saul would be safe. It sounded too good to be true, but she knew she had to take the chance. "I'll need time to prepare," Margaret said finally, "but if you can help, then I'll listen." Gideon nodded. "I'll be back in 2 days. Have everything ready. We'll get you and Saul out of here. No questions asked." With that, He turned and disappeared back into the woods. Margaret stood there for a long moment, her mind racing. She didn't trust Gideon, not completely, but she knew that if there was a chance to save Saul, she couldn't waste it. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret spent every waking hour gathering supplies, securing everything she could possibly need to escape. She knew this was her one shot. If she hesitated, they'd be found. Saul was already skittish, the dart still having its effects on his body. But he was with her, and that was all that mattered. By the time Gideon returned, Margaret had packed what little they could carry. She had no way of knowing if this was the right decision. But deep down, she knew that they couldn't keep running forever. When Gideon arrived, he didn't waste any time. "We've got to move now," he said, his tone urgent. Margaret nodded, her heart pounding as she led Saul out of the barn. "Is it safe?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's as safe as it's going to get," Gideon replied, glancing around. "We'll be out of here before anyone notices." The three of them moved quickly through the woods, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the main roads. The air was cold, biting at their skin, but Margaret didn't feel it. Her mind was elsewhere, racing with thoughts of what would happen next. Would they make it? Would Saul ever be the same again? Gideon led the way, his steps sure, but Margaret noticed how tense he was. There was a weight in his shoulders, something that wasn't there before. He glanced over his shoulder often, like he was waiting for something to jump out of the trees at them. They traveled through the forest for what seemed like hours. Margaret couldn't keep track of time. Her only focus was on getting to the place Gideon had promised, where they could finally be safe. Finally, they reached a small clearing. In the distance, a truck waited, its headlights dim, parked behind a line of thick trees. Margaret stopped, her breath catching in her throat. "Is this it?" she asked, voice shaking. "Yeah," Gideon said. "Get in, quick." She didn't hesitate. She walked quickly toward the truck, helping Saul into the back before climbing in herself. The door slammed shut behind them, and the truck roared to life. As the truck sped away from the woods, Margaret stared out the window. She felt a mix of relief and uncertainty. They were leaving everything behind, everything she had worked for, the life she had built with Saul. But it was the only choice left. As the miles passed, Margaret turned to Saul, resting her hand on his fur. He was exhausted, his body still recovering from the dart, but he nuzzled into her touch. Margaret whispered to him, her voice full of emotion. "We'll be all right, Saul, I promise." As the truck rumbled along the winding road, Margaret couldn't shake the nagging doubt in her mind. She glanced at Gideon, who sat in the front seat, his face unreadable in the dim light. Why was he doing this? Why was he helping her and Saul? She had heard the stories, seen the coldness in his eyes when they first met. There had been no indication that he cared about anyone, let alone a woman and a fox. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she considered him. Was he truly trying to help? Or was he using her and Saul for something else? She didn't believe in coincidences. The way he had shown up in her life, offering promises of protection when she had nowhere else to turn, it seemed almost too convenient. She remembered the vague details of his past, how he had been in and out of jobs, always on the fringes of the law. No one in the village really knew him. Could he be trusted? But there was something else too, something about the way he spoke. There was a sincerity in his voice when he promised that he could protect Saul. It wasn't a hardened, manipulative tone, it was a quiet determination. For the first time since meeting him, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he meant what he said. She glanced at Saul, who was curled up in the back, his head resting on her lap. The fox seemed to be calming down, the effects of the tranquilizer wearing off. His eyes fluttered open briefly, and Margaret reached down to stroke his fur gently. "We're almost there, Saul," she whispered, trying to reassure herself as much as him. Turning her attention back to Gideon, Margaret finally spoke. "Why are you helping us?" Her voice was steady, but the question had been haunting her since he first appeared in the woods. Gideon didn't look at her immediately. Instead, he focused on the road ahead, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice low. "I've been where you are," he said quietly. "I've had my share of running from things, hiding. I know what it's like to have everything on the line and have no one to trust." Margaret felt a chill at his words. Was he speaking from experience? She had no way of knowing for sure. But there was something in his tone that made her believe it wasn't a lie. "I'm not asking for your trust," he continued, glancing at her briefly, "but I've seen what Saul means to you. And I don't think you should lose him. Not like this. Maybe it's redemption for me. Maybe it's just because I can help." The words hung in the air, thick with ambiguity. Margaret couldn't fully explain it, but something in his expression, something raw and honest, made her wonder if this was real. As the truck sped further away from the village, Margaret knew she was taking a massive risk. But she also knew that staying behind wasn't an option. The hunters were still out there, and Saul wouldn't survive another attack. This was the only chance she had to get him out of harm's way. She took a deep breath, letting the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. She couldn't afford to second-guess herself now. They had come this far. There was no turning back. As the truck sped away from the village, Margaret couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. It wasn't just the feeling of being chased. She had been running for days now. It was the realization that someone was after them, specifically Saul, and she had no idea why. The hunters, led by a man named Corwin, had been relentless in their pursuit. Margaret had heard rumors of people who hunted animals for sport, for profit, but there was something different about these hunters. They weren't interested in Saul for any of the usual reasons. Their purpose, though unclear, seemed far more sinister. Gideon had warned her about Corwin's group. "They're not just hunters," he had said in a quiet voice, as they prepared to leave the village. "They've been hired by someone with deep pockets, someone who wants that fox." Margaret had asked him more questions, but Gideon had refused to elaborate, his eyes clouding with a mixture of fear and caution. He had hinted that the situation was dangerous, but he hadn't given her any concrete details. Margaret's mind raced with possibilities. Who would want Saul? What was so special about a fox that it would attract such attention? Days passed, and the truck carried them farther into the woods. But the nagging question still gnawed at Margaret. She could feel the weight of her suspicions creeping in again, making her question everything. Why would Corwin's group chase a wild animal? A fox, unless there was something more to it? Her answer came in the form of a conversation between Gideon and a man Margaret didn't recognize. The truck had stopped for a brief moment to rest, and Margaret overheard snippets of their discussion. She wasn't meant to hear it, but it was impossible to ignore. "You sure we can get him?" the man asked. "Yeah, the buyer's ready. This one's special. They'll pay top dollar for him," Gideon replied. The word buyer hit Margaret like a punch to the gut. They were selling Saul. She felt a surge of betrayal. Gideon, the person she had trusted, was involved in something far darker than she had imagined. Before she could process the weight of the conversation, Saul let out a low growl, his body stiffening beside her. Margaret's attention snapped back to him. She could tell that something was wrong. He had heard it too. He didn't trust Gideon anymore, and Margaret wasn't sure she did either. She sat in silence, her mind spinning. The hunters weren't just after Saul for the thrill of the chase, they were after something more. Something that Margaret couldn't fully understand yet. But she knew one thing. If she didn't act soon, Saul would be sold to whoever was behind this sinister plot. She wasn't sure how far this would go, but she knew she had to stop it before it was too late. The weight of the conversation hit Margaret hard. Her mind raced, thinking about everything that had happened and the horrible truth she had just discovered. Gideon wasn't helping them because he cared about Saul or her. It was all about money. He was part of this twisted operation, selling animals like Saul to the highest bidder. That realization cut deeper than anything else she had experienced. But there was no time to dwell on her growing sense of betrayal. They had to keep moving. The truck continued to rumble down the road, and Margaret found herself on the edge of panic, unsure of what to do next. The truck stopped suddenly, jerking Margaret out of her thoughts. They had arrived at an abandoned farmhouse, its structure weathered and decaying. The windows were boarded up, and the overgrown grass hinted that no one had lived here in years. "This is where we part ways," Gideon said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The truck will take Saul from here to the buyer. I'll stay back. You're free to go." Margaret's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, I'm free to go?" she asked, her voice trembling with anger and fear. "You told me you were helping us." "I am," Gideon replied, but his eyes were distant. "This is where you'll be safe. Saul will be out of harm's way. And that's what matters. Trust me." Margaret stood frozen for a moment. She had always known there was something wrong, But now it was too late to back out. She had trusted him, and now she had no choice. She could feel Sol's weight in the air, his presence somehow calming her. But still, she felt the grip of betrayal tightening around her chest. "Get out of the truck. Margaret." Gideon's voice broke through her thoughts. "There's nothing more I can do." Reluctantly, Margaret climbed out of the truck, keeping Sol close. She wasn't sure what to do next. As she stepped away from the vehicle, the truck's engine roared to life again, and it began to pull away. Margaret's heart sank, but she didn't have time to waste. She turned and walked toward the farmhouse. The air felt colder now, the feeling of betrayal lingering with every step. Was this really how it was going to end? Was she just left to watch as Sol was taken from her for good? Just as she reached the farmhouse, she heard a voice call out to her from behind. "Margaret." It was Gideon. His voice was urgent. She turned to see him walking toward her, his expression unreadable. There was something different in his eyes now, a flicker of something that resembled guilt. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I've been part of something bad. But you and Sol deserve better than this. I'll help you get him back." Margaret stood still, her heart racing as she processed his words. Could she trust him again? The question loomed heavy in her mind. "I'll get him back, Margaret," Gideon continued. "It's not too late. I can still make this right." Margaret hesitated for a long moment, then nodded, not entirely sure whether she could believe him. But something in his eyes told her he wasn't lying this time. There was a chance, however small, that he was telling the truth. Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her, though it was tempered by the uncertainty that lingered in the air. She wasn't sure whether she could trust Gideon again, but there was no choice. Sol had already been through enough, and Margaret was determined to give him the chance to live a life free from fear and betrayal. "I'm not sure I believe you," Margaret said, her voice steady but filled with doubt. "But if you're serious, if you really want to help, then show me. Prove it." Gideon nodded, his expression firm. "I will, but we don't have time. They'll be looking for us soon." Without another word, he turned and started walking towards the edge of the clearing, where a rusted jeep waited, hidden behind a thick row of trees. Margaret followed, Sol trotting by her side. She looked over her shoulder one last time, half expecting to see the shadows of hunters creeping closer. But the forest was eerily still. The jeep's engine sputtered to life, and as they drove through the woods, Margaret couldn't help but wonder who these mysterious buyers were. Who would pay for a fox? Why had Corwin and his group been after Sol? Was it really about money? Or was there something more? Gideon seemed to sense her unease, but didn't speak. He kept his eyes on the road, his jaw clenched, as if fighting with his own conscience. Margaret could see the weight of his actions pressing down on him. For the first time, he didn't seem like the cold, calculating man who had first appeared in the village. They didn't stop until they reached a small, isolated cabin in the woods. The place was hidden well enough to avoid detection, and it looked deserted, its windows dark. The air around it was tense, but there was a strange sense of quiet safety. "This is it," Gideon said, opening the door to the cabin. "We're safe here for now. No one will find us." Margaret stepped inside, looking around cautiously. It wasn't much, but it was a place where they could regroup and figure out their next move. Sol wandered inside, sniffing the air, before curling up by the fireplace. Margaret sank into a nearby chair, her mind still racing with questions. She didn't know how much she could trust Gideon, but for now, he had delivered on his promise to get them away from danger. As the night wore on, Margaret sat silently, watching Sol rest. The storm outside had picked up, the wind howling through the trees. The cabin felt safe for the moment, but Margaret knew they couldn't stay here forever. The buyers would eventually come, and they would want Sol. But Margaret wasn't about to let that happen. "I'll make sure he stays safe," Gideon said, his voice soft but firm. "No one will take him from you." Margaret looked up at him, her heart torn. She still didn't fully trust him, but she had no other choice. For Sol's sake, she would have to believe in him, for now. The days that followed in the cabin were a strange blend of tension and reluctant hope. Margaret knew they couldn't stay forever, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a semblance of safety. Sol was recovering, his movements becoming more fluid as the tranquilizer wore off. He seemed calmer, but Margaret could sense the lingering wariness in his eyes. The trauma from everything that had happened. The cabin was small, and the nights were long. Margaret spent most of her time sitting near the fireplace, her thoughts constantly returning to the events that had led them here. Who were the buyers, really? And why was Gideon involved in such a dangerous game? She couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was far more complicated than what he had let on. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Gideon spoke up. "We can't stay here for much longer," he said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for hours. Margaret looked up at him, her gaze sharp. "I know, but we can't just go back to the village either. They'll find us." Gideon's face tightened, his eyes scanning the darkening forest outside. "There's a place, a remote location where no one will look for you. It's my last option, but it's safe. The people there, they'll understand. I can't go with you, but I can send you there." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "Where is it? I'll get you a map," Gideon said, turning away for a moment to rummage through a drawer. "It's a cabin, off the grid. No one will find you. But you have to leave before they do." Margaret stood up quickly, a sense of urgency overtaking her. "You're sure it's safe?" she asked, her voice shaking with both fear and hope. "I've been there before. You'll be safe," Gideon answered, his voice low, but there was something in it that made her believe him, even if she still had her doubts. With the map in hand, Margaret gathered the few belongings she had managed to bring with her and turned to Saul, who was resting by the fireplace. "Come on, Saul," she murmured, brushing his fur gently. "We're leaving." The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, they set out, following the map. Margaret didn't look back as they left the cabin. She knew that if they stayed any longer, it would be too late. The hunters were getting closer, and the only thing that mattered now was getting Saul to safety. As they walked deeper into the woods, Margaret's thoughts kept drifting back to Gideon. Was he truly trying to help them? Or was he just another part of the twisted game? She wasn't sure, but one thing was certain: he had given them a chance to escape. And that was enough for now. The journey through the woods was slow but steady. The map Gideon had given them proved to be accurate, and after hours of walking, Margaret began to feel a small sense of relief. They were getting closer to the cabin, the one place where they might find some peace. The air grew colder as they neared the secluded spot, and Margaret quickened her pace, anxious to reach the safety of the cabin. Saul, still recovering from the tranquilizer, walked beside her, his steps slower than usual, but he seemed more alert. It was as if he too understood the gravity of the situation. Sensing that the end of their flight was near, eventually, they arrived at the cabin, a small, weathered structure nestled between towering pines. Margaret felt a strange sense of finality as she stepped inside. It wasn't much, but it would do for now. The door creaked as she pushed it open, and she was immediately met with the smell of wood and damp earth. Saul padded in behind her, his nose twitching as he explored the unfamiliar space. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished, but there was a warmth to it, the kind that came from long-term use. Margaret set down her pack and turned to Saul, who was already curling up in front of the small fireplace. She joined him, watching the flames flicker and dance as they provided the only light in the otherwise dark room. The night passed in uneasy silence. The outside world felt a million miles away, but Margaret knew it wasn't truly safe yet. She had made it this far, but the threat of the hunters still loomed. She couldn't afford to relax completely, not until they were far enough away from the village and the dangers that followed them. As the days passed, Margaret and Saul settled into their new routine. The cabin was isolated enough that they didn't have to worry about being found, at least for now. But Margaret couldn't stop thinking about the people who were still after Saul. She was grateful for the safe haven, but a part of her knew the danger wasn't over. One morning, as she was tending to a small fire outside, she saw a figure approaching from the woods. Her heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively stepped in front of Saul, ready to protect him at all costs. But as the figure drew closer, she realized it was Gideon. He approached cautiously, his face tense but softer than the last time she had seen him. "I couldn't stay away," he said, his voice rough. "I had to make sure you were safe." Margaret didn't know what to say. She had mixed feelings about Gideon's return. Part of her wanted to thank him, and the other part still felt the sting of betrayal. "I don't know what to think about you," she said quietly, looking him in the eyes. "But I guess you've proven me wrong." Gideon nodded, his gaze steady. "I know I don't deserve your trust, but I'm not going anywhere. I'll help you keep Saul safe." I promise." Margaret hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. She wasn't sure if she could ever fully trust Gideon again. But for now, she needed him. They were in this together now, whether they liked it or not. As they stood there in the quiet of the woods, the tension between them began to ease. Just a little. They still had a long road ahead. But for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt that maybe, just maybe, they could make it through this. The days spent in the cabin were simple, yet full of constant vigilance. Margaret had learned to make do with what little they had: canned food, some basic supplies, and the forest surrounding them. She had a small stove for heating water, and there was enough dried meat and fruits to get them by. But it was always a struggle, trying to make sure Saul had enough food to regain his strength without overexerting himself in the woods. Gideon, when he wasn't busy checking the perimeter of the cabin or watching for any signs of trouble, would help out with hunting. He had a knack for tracking, and occasionally he'd bring back a rabbit or a small game to supplement their meals. Margaret would boil water and cook whatever they had, making the best of the meager provisions. One evening, as they sat around a small fire, a thought struck Margaret. She had been so focused on keeping Saul safe. She hadn't considered what would happen if their pursuers grew closer. Gideon had said he would help. But how far was he willing to go? How much of a risk was he willing to take? "I think we need to alert someone," Margaret said, breaking the silence. "The hunters, Corwin and his people, they won't stop. We need to do something before they find us." Gideon looked at her, his expression thoughtful but guarded. "And what do you want to do? Call the police?" He shook his head. "They've got their connections. Whoever's behind this has power. It's not that simple. But there's someone we could call." Margaret pressed. "There's a group, a non-governmental organization. They work on animal protection, environmental issues. If I can get in touch with them, they might be able to help us." Gideon hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he nodded. "If you think it'll work." "I do," Margaret said, feeling a surge of determination. "I've heard about them before. They've taken on dangerous cases. If they have the resources, they could help us shut this down." She quickly made a plan. The group she had in mind was well known for their work in protecting endangered species and stopping illegal hunting operations. They had the means to track and report these kinds of crimes. Margaret didn't know if they could help directly, but the idea of reaching out for assistance gave her a glimmer of hope. The next day, while Gideon was away scouting the area, Margaret used a satellite phone she had hidden away. After several minutes of tense dialing, she was connected to someone who could help. "They've agreed to send someone," Margaret said, as she hung up the phone, her voice filled with a new sense of relief. "We'll be safe soon, Saul." By the time Gideon returned, Margaret had packed everything they might need for the journey ahead. She wasn't sure how much longer they could stay in the cabin, but she knew the time had come to leave. They would meet the team that was coming to assist them, an experienced group ready to help Saul and bring down those responsible for the illegal hunting operation. Saul seemed to sense that things were changing. He stood up, stretched his legs, and padded over to Margaret's side, his golden eyes steady and trusting. She smiled and gave him a gentle pat. "We'll be okay, Saul," she whispered, with a renewed sense of purpose. Margaret and Gideon set off toward the meeting point. It was a journey that took them deep into the woods, farther than they had ever gone before. But this time, Margaret felt a renewed sense of hope. The people coming to help them had the power and knowledge to fight back, to ensure that Saul would never again be hunted for profit. As they trekked deeper into the forest, Margaret kept her eyes fixed ahead, focusing on the path. The air was crisp, and the sound of their footsteps crunching through the snow seemed to be the only noise in the vast wilderness. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. They were getting closer to the meeting point, but she still wasn't sure what to expect from the team that was supposed to help them. Gideon walked beside her, his steps quiet, but there was something in the way he looked at her, something that suggested he was no longer the man who had come to the village for money. Margaret had seen him change, seen him fight his own demons. The question was whether that change was enough to earn her trust, and if they could really trust the people he was sending them to. They reached a clearing in the woods, the trees parting to reveal a small, nondescript cabin. It was a place that blended seamlessly into the landscape, with no signs of activity. There were no vehicles, no footprints leading up to the door. It was perfect, a perfect hiding place. The team was already there. A man stepped out from behind the cabin. His expression calm but serious. He was tall, with dark hair and a rugged, weathered look that suggested he had spent his life in the wilderness. "You made it," he said, giving a curt nod. His voice was deep and steady. "Gideon said you'd be here. We'll take care of things from here. You're safe now." Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. But it was quickly replaced with uncertainty. They had made it this far. But it wasn't over yet. "I'm glad you're here," Margaret said, stepping forward. "But what about the buyers? The people who are behind this? How can we stop them?" The man's expression hardened, his jaw tightening. "We have connections. People in higher places. We've been tracking these kinds of operations for years. Don't worry, they won't get away with it." Margaret nodded, but a small part of her still wasn't sure. Was it really over? Could they trust these people to get the job done? The man gestured for them to follow him. They entered the cabin, and inside was a small but well-equipped operation. Maps, computers, and radio equipment covered the table. People were moving in and out, speaking in low tones, working together like a well-oiled machine. "This is where we'll make our stand," the man said. "We've already contacted the authorities. They're moving in, but we need to be quick. If we don't act now, the people behind this will slip away." Margaret felt a sudden surge of gratitude. This was it, the final push to take down the people who had caused them so much pain. She could see it in the eyes of the people here. This wasn't just a job for them. This was personal. As the team prepared for the operation, Margaret turned to Gideon, her mind still racing with thoughts of the journey ahead. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice tinged with emotion. "I never thought I'd say this. But, thank you for helping." Gideon met her gaze, his expression softening. "I owe you more than I can say. I'm glad I could do something right for once." The team moved quickly, preparing to head out. Margaret felt a glimmer of hope rise inside her. This time, they would win. They had made it this far. And with the help of the right people, they could finish what they had started. The time for running was over. It was time to fight back. The days following Margaret's call for help were filled with tension. The cabin, which once felt like a safe haven, now felt like a trap. The uncertainty was unbearable, as every small noise from the forest made her jump. She spent most of her time near Saul, keeping watch, her mind racing with thoughts of what could go wrong. Gideon had become more distant, often disappearing into the woods for hours at a time. He kept a sharp eye out for any signs of trouble. But even he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Margaret knew that they had to rely on the team coming to help. But the waiting was starting to wear her down. The sound of approaching vehicles finally broke the silence one afternoon. "They're here," Margaret whispered, her heart pounding. She turned to Gideon, who nodded but kept his guard up. "Let's move quickly," he said, his voice tense. "We can't let them get too close." Gideon led the way through the trees, his movements quick but careful. Margaret followed closely behind, keeping Saul on a tight leash. The feeling of being pursued never left her. She constantly glanced over her shoulder, waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, a rustle came from behind them. Margaret's pulse quickened. "They're here," she muttered under her breath. Out from the trees emerged a group of figures, some holding rifles. The leader, Corwin, stepped forward with a sneer. "Did you really think you could escape us, Gideon?" Corwin's voice was laced with mockery. He looked at Margaret. "You'll regret interfering with us." Margaret took a step forward, positioning herself in front of Saul. "We're not going anywhere with you," she said, her voice firm despite the fear coursing through her veins. Corwin laughed, raising his rifle. "You don't have a choice, lady." Before things could escalate, a shout rang out. "Step away from them." A group of armed individuals, the team Margaret had called, emerged from the trees. The leader, a woman dressed in tactical gear, leveled her weapon at Corwin's group. "Drop your weapons," she commanded. "You're under arrest for illegal hunting and animal trafficking." Corwin's group hesitated, then slowly lowered their rifles. They knew they were outnumbered. "Get them," the woman ordered, and her team moved in swiftly. The hunters were quickly restrained, their weapons taken. Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her as the authorities gained control of the situation. Gideon turned to her. "It's over," he said quietly. "You're safe." Margaret watched as the hunters were led away in handcuffs, her heart still racing. Saul stood beside her, watching the scene, his tension slowly easing. It was over. They had won. For the first time in days, Margaret allowed herself to breathe. With the hunters detained and the authorities securing the area, Margaret finally felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in days. The forest, which had once been a place of fear and uncertainty, now felt like home again. Saul, who had been so tense during the entire ordeal, stood quietly by her side. The weight of their journey was beginning to lift. Gideon approached her, his expression softening as he took in the scene. "We made it," he said, the words carrying a quiet relief. Margaret nodded, but her thoughts were far from finished. "Will they be okay?" she asked, glancing back at the hunters being taken into custody. "What about their operation? They won't be causing trouble anymore." Gideon assured her, "The authorities are handling it. They've got enough evidence to take them down for good." Margaret breathed a sigh of relief. It wasn't just about her safety or souls anymore. It was about putting an end to a cycle of harm that had been going on for far too long. She looked down at Saul, who was now lying calmly at her feet. He was no longer the animal they had hunted, the one they had tried to break. He was free. As the team packed up their gear and prepared to leave, Margaret walked over to Saul. Kneeling beside him, she ran her fingers through his fur, feeling his warmth, his steadiness. "You've earned this, Saul," she whispered. "A life of peace, a life without fear." Gideon watched from a distance, and Margaret could see the gratitude in his eyes. There were no words needed between them anymore. They had both been through hell, but together, they had come out the other side. Margaret stood up, taking a deep breath. She turned to the team leader. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "We wouldn't have made it without you." The leader nodded, offering a smile. "We all play a part in this," she replied, "but it's people like you who make the difference." With the last of the hunters taken away and the scene clearing, Margaret and Gideon began the long walk back to the village. The snow was gently falling again, and for the first time in what felt like forever, it seemed like the world had slowed down. The air was colder than it had been, but it didn't matter. They had made it through the storm, and everything was finally as it should be. As they walked, Margaret glanced at Saul, who trotted happily beside them. "What's next?" she asked quietly. Gideon looked up at the snowy sky and gave a small smile. "For now, we breathe, we heal." Margaret nodded, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that there was hope for Saul, for herself, and for the world they lived in.